We're here to celebrate Verso's 50th anniversary, looking back at important works that Verso have published and the development of left political and intellectual landscapes. In celebrating this, we're here to discuss Stella Dadzie's upcoming book, A Kick in the Belly, that will shake up our often misunderstood knowledge of Black women and resistance during the slave trade. Stella Dadzie is a published writer and historian best known for The Heart of the Race, Black Women's Lives in Britain, which won the 1985 Martin Luther King Award for Literature and was republished by Verso in 2018 as a feminist classic. Her forthcoming book, A Kick in the Belly, Women's Slavery and Resistance, is due to be published by Verso in October 2020. She is a founding member of the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent, a national umbrella group for Black women that emerged in the late 1970s as part of the British civil rights movement. She was recently described as one of the grandmothers of Black Feminism in the UK, and her personal archive in Brixton's Black Cultural Archives is one of the most visited by researchers and scholars. Her career as a writer, artist and education activist spans over 40 years. She has written numerous publications and resources aimed at promoting an inclusive curriculum and good practice with Black adult learners and other minorities, including resources to decolonize and diversify the UK national curriculum in schools and colleges. She is well known within the UK for her contribution to tackling youth racism and working with racist perpetrators, and is a key contributor to the development of anti-racist strategies with schools, colleges and youth services. In November 2003, she received the NBM Network for Black Managers Award for outstanding contributions to race equality in further education. Wow, so that's a huge introduction. It's such an honour to be in conversation with you today, Stella. First of all, how are you?
I'm good, despite everything. Yes, I'm good.
I wanted to start by reading a quote from planter Monk Lewis, taken from chapter 4 of A Kick in the Belly. So, I have not passed 6 months in Jamaica and I've already found on one of my estates a woman who has been kicked in the womb by a white bookkeeper, by which she was crippled herself, and on another one of my estates, another woman who has been kicked in the womb by another white bookkeeper, by which he crippled the child. My 2 estates are on the 2 extremities of the island. I am entitled to say, from my own knowledge, that white bookkeepers kick Black women in the belly from one end of Jamaica to the other. So, beyond the physical, what might this quote mean metaphorically in the context of Black women's oppression during slavery? And was the title of your book inspired by this quote?
Well, to answer your first question, to answer your second question first, yes, it was. It was inspired by that quote. The quote worked perfectly for me as a metaphor for all the physical trauma that enslaved Black women endured during the period of slavery. And I think that as a woman, we can't think of the physical act of being kicked in the belly without a reflexive hug. Our bellies are the locus of our life cycle, our menstruation, our sexuality, childbirth, procreation, menopause, all those things that measure our lives. And the act of kicking a woman there is an assault on the very core of our being, which is what slavery was about. So, as I say, I think the title conveys what the book is trying to deal with.
Yeah, when I got to that chapter and saw that quote, I thought, okay, this makes sense. And I think
it's at the beginning of the book as well. It should be right at the beginning.
Yeah, I think you've done a really good job of what you say, that reflexive hugging of the body and what that represents. Is that I kind of felt that way when I was reading throughout the whole book. It was a constant inward reflection and connection to what our ancestors must have been feeling during these times, that your writing really illuminates that.
Thank you.
A Kick in the Belly is rather unique in that it tells the experiences of Black women in slavery, a narrative that has been erased from history or perhaps mistold. How is this text important in relation to decolonising our histories, and especially in relation to how we as Black people can be a part of the reproduction of a certain narrative?
Okay, well, I think decolonising British history is going to involve unearthing many, many untold narratives. And since Black women have been effectively hidden from history, our stories need to be told and they need to be retold. With very, very few exceptions, enslaved women didn't have access to pen and paper. And so what that's meant is, in practice, our stories have been told for us. They've been told in the diaries of men like Monk Lewis, who you've just mentioned, and men like Thomas Thistlewood, and also in parliamentary reports and in plantation inventories and all kinds of other paperwork, none of which was written by us. So if you think about a quote, I think I used it in the book, by Barbara Bush, who says words to the effect that history has been written by men for men, and thus records only what men wish to see, then clearly what we're talking about is decolonizing the narrative, not just from the point of view of race, but also from the point of view of gender. And that means bringing our perspectives and sensibilities to the table, as well as the sort of bare, bald facts and dates of the history that we're talking about. And it means ensuring that our history or her story is not told through the lens of a white male perspective or through the lens of racism and misogyny. Now, I should say that I certainly don't want to suggest that all white men are racist or misogynist. That would be ridiculous. And I should say now that people like myself owe a huge debt of gratitude to men like Basil Davidson and to men like Peter Fryer. But as I say, we need to build on that work and place women centre stage, which is where we belong. In terms of our own role in reproducing certain narratives, I think you went on to ask me something about what that means for us in terms of our own reproduction of the narrative. I think we do need to guard against stereotypes and sound bites, particularly in the age of the internet. You know, I'm often quite disappointed by the stuff that I see circulating on my phone, you know, the selective truths, the things that only tell half the story. And I think, you know, as Black people, we need to recognise that history is complex. You know, it can never be one-dimensional. And it's not enough to say, you know, rah, 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 look at us, look at what we did. We need to own our history, warts and all.
Yeah, that absolutely comes across in your writing, because you tell a very nuanced story, not just as women as victims, but women that took on a whole manner of different roles in order to navigate slavery.
Well, I thought that was important, you know, because quite often slavery is told from the perspective, or not even from the perspective, it's told in a way that simply victimises us. It makes us lose all agency. We were herded together, we were shipped across the Atlantic, we were done to. And of course, that's not the whole story. And, you know, as an African woman, I know very well from personal experience that class plays a huge role in not just the story of enslavement, but also the story of colonialism and the story of imperialism. So it was important to me in telling that story to also identify women who'd had other roles in relation to enslavement, some of whom benefited from it, some of whom simply stood as icons in terms of their resistance to it. And I'm talking about women who resisted on the African continent before the ships even began to take people away.
Yeah. And so I think your book is a really good example of how we can begin to decolonise our histories. And so in response to the lecturers or academics that say, well, there's no information out there, it's hard to find anything about this, what would you say then to researchers that use that as perhaps an excuse not to decolonise their practices, but also perhaps you could tell us about what your process was in writing and researching A Kick in the Belly?
Okay. Well, it began, as I think I say in the introduction, as an MA thesis. I was really lucky in around 1985 to get a sabbatical year from teaching and to go to SOAS, and I just immersed myself in that quest to find out what happened to those invisible women. And I think, as anyone who studies at that level will know, you know, when you start delving into your subject, you find a whole range of books and theses and articles and papers, most of which we wouldn't know about unless we knew where to look. And the reason we don't know about them is because they're targeted at fellow academics. So in terms of the kick in the belly, the work had already begun. You know, there were historians, people like Lucille Maturin-Mayer, Hilary Beckles, Olive Senior, Richard Sheridan. There's a whole number, that's just to name a few, who'd already begun to focus on the lived experience of enslaved West Indian women. So, you know, I make no excuses. I'm standing on those people's shoulders. But of course, 30 years on, with access to the internet, there's a great deal more out there, including, you know, academic papers that you can upload almost as they're written. And, you know, if you know what you're looking for and also where to look for it, you can find it.
Yeah.
But I think you'll know from reading The Heart of the Race that accessibility is one of my passions. I can't see the point of unearthing that history and all that knowledge unless it's made available to a wider audience. So my process involved revisiting my original work, expanding it, augmenting it, updating it, and also reworking it so that it was presented in a language that hopefully anyone can read, whether or not they've been to university.
Yeah. And so, yeah, you've just answered my next question, which is perfect. Because I guess in the sense of a lot of academic texts are usually full of exclusionary jargon, even when they are written about our histories or written for us or told by the victors and through a colonial lens. So I guess to build on what you've just said, why do you feel it's important to write histories in such an accessible way?
You know, you don't need to be an academic to understand the past. But often, you know, when you start to read academic history texts, you find that they're mystified. They're mystified through language, they're mystified through concepts that are used. And I see this as a way that we use, people who come from academia, to keep the debates exclusive and to keep it within the club, if you like. So I don't know, ever since I began teaching adults in the late 70s, I think it was, I've been committed to the principle of teaching history in a language that our communities can access. And you know, my question is, if we don't do that, who is this history for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I struggled studying history at an undergrad level was how exclusionary the texts were. I found myself having to reread the same pages over and over, and I had synonyms, I had the dictionary up constantly with some of these words, and it just made it very hard to understand it and to access it, especially when you need to pause every minute to kind of research, well, what are they saying? And there's an assumed amount of knowledge when they write these texts as well. And this is one thing that I really love about both of your books, actually, about The Heart of the Race and A Kick in the Belly, is that you could pick it up with very little or any prior knowledge to it, and it will paint a very vivid picture of that piece of history. And I think there needs to be more of a conscious effort across the board for us to make these histories more accessible and our academic writing more accessible, that things shouldn't just be written in a certain way for a certain audience, because, as you say, that's exclusionary, and these histories are for all of us.
Yeah, and we need to be writing them as children's books, as popular history texts, and obviously making them accessible through television and films as well. I was smiling when you were talking because I was remembering my own experience of going to SOAS with a history O-level. And because I'd just written The Heart of the Race and it was all up there in lights, there was a sort of sense that I must know everything. And of course, I knew nothing. I was completely self-taught in terms of Black history anyway. I'd had to go out and find that stuff for myself, as most of my generation had. And I remember sitting in lecture rooms to begin with and feeling completely silenced, completely frightened to speak, because I didn't have access to that language. I wasn't always sure what they were talking about when they were going on about post-structuralist this and postmodernist that. It made no sense to me. And I remember this kind of eureka moment when I went home and I just thought, wait a minute, this is my history. This is my continent. I come from this place. Nobody, who simply studied it in books is going to tell me that they know more than what I have experienced and lived through visiting Jamaica, through access to my own Ghanaian family. And it was that moment that gave me power. It gave me a sense that, no, I'm not going to be frightened from this material. I'm going to engage with it. I'm going to embrace it, and I'm going to make what sense of it that I can. And I think that's a really important process that all of us need to go through in a way. If we are keen to study history, we need to not be intimidated by language and by academia and mystification, and just recognise this is our history, and we need to be able to both tell it like it is and understand it as it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I can agree with you more. I think academia has a very sly and they have a very sly way of making you feel like, oh, I can't tap into my own history because I don't understand what you're saying. Just as you were saying with your eureka moment, I felt that. So I also studied sociology for a while, and we did race for a short amount of time. And all the texts were obviously written by white people. They were written in a certain way about us. And I remember thinking, oh, well, maybe I don't know that much about myself, my lived experience then. And as you say, like how, academia has a very sly way of making you feel like you can't even connect with your own history and your own lived experience.
Yeah, it's almost anthropological, isn't it? It's interesting how these people do these things. And I think that's why, it's important. Well, you're going to ask me later, I think, but, why it's important to tell the story from our own perspective.
So I wanted to ask you, or to say, rather, the erasure of Black women's voices from history is a further insult to their memory. Would you say that in particular Black women's involvement in liberation struggles throughout history has, for want of a better word, been relegated to the margins? And how does this impact our own connection to our ancestral struggle and the ways that we see ourselves in the world today? And so I've put a note that you might want to talk about Heart of the Race or wherever you feel, yeah.
Well, most definitely we've been relegated to the margins. There's absolutely no question about that. We've been too busy with surviving, feeding our kids, nurturing our communities, and doing all the things that Black women do to big ourselves up the way white men do in films and books. That's the way I see it, You only have to think about how rare it is to see a leading Black female character, in any Hollywood movie to realise how effectively our stories have been relegated and erased. We've been, fed a diet of white male historic achievement, really, if you think about it, from James Bond right through to The Bourne Identity and all those other movies. I mean, they're great fun to watch, but hey, where are we? And that's why we get so excited when we see a movie like Harriet, the movie about Harriet Tubman, because it is so rare to see a powerful, strong, resilient Black woman up on that screen. So, there's that, and there's also, I think I wanted to add there, the fact that when our stories are told, often they're sabotaged, so that the story becomes about a white man. If you think about Wilberforce, it was all about his guilt conscience. It wasn't actually, and Amistad was another one. It was all about what's his name, Adams, the president, fighting to resolve a legal issue of who the slaves belonged to. But the slaves were almost like an afterthought, in my view, anyway. Yeah. I mean, people may not agree with me, but we need to correct this and to make sure that Black women's voices are heard. And I think if you think about the Heart of the Race, what's interesting for me is that 30 years after it was published, I'm still meeting people who say, I didn't know this. This is new to me. I hadn't heard these stories before. Or as somebody said to me back in 85, I've never seen the stories I've heard around my kitchen table told to me by my mother and my grandmother reproduced in print. I've never seen that. So if you think about that in relation to the central role that black women have played in British society, the central role that black women have played within our own communities, you know, we're talking about a hidden history. There's no other way to describe it. Now, if you link that to what Marcus Garvey has said about a people without a history is like a tree without roots, or to something that I read recently by an author I love called Richard Zimmerman. I can't remember the exact quote, but he says something like, "Our lives are written in ink that has been bequeathed to us." And I thought that was such a powerful statement, because none of us are here today because of something, unless it was because of something that someone did before we came. And usually we're talking about some woman. So, you know, if we think about the struggles and the sacrifices of our ancestors, the only way that we can really know ourselves is by connecting to that history and by connecting to those stories.
Yeah. It's such a rarity to be able to read a book written about our histories by us. So when I've been reading your text, for example, I felt an extra level of connectedness to the contents of the material and the history, and knowing that it was written by a black woman as well. And I think that just goes to show that it's very rare to come across these texts, and especially as someone that's been through all the way throughout the British schooling system, and the fact that even today, now that I'm finding it very rare to be reading these books, I think it really does... It is a testament to how important these texts are, and how thankful I am to you personally for writing these books. And in terms of what you said about representation in TV, you're absolutely right. In film, it's always, if it's going to be about any black characters, it will always be about how the white person has saved them. So like the Green Book, I didn't even watch that because I knew it was going to be about that. I can't even think of other examples right now, but there's a lot of films where it's how the white person has saved this black person from themselves, and then like, oh, how wonderful, okay, maybe racism isn't that, you know, not as bad as we thought it was, and then you're left thinking, oh, these white people are so nice, like, thank you for doing that.
Gratitude.
So A Kick in the Belly was hard to read, not because of the style of writing or anything like that, but just in terms of how emotive it was. The way in which you write really illuminates the horrors and the sacrifices and the rare wins that black women experienced during this period. There were times that I did take pause and I did shed a few tears, where I had to kind of sit with what I had just learnt before moving on to the next part. So your style of writing juxtaposes context and analysis between testimonials of people who lived it. And this is the same style of writing that I loved in The Heart of the Race, because it really brought to life what I was reading. And so why is it important to tell history in this way?
Well, you know, I think many of us come from oral cultures. You know, we come from cultures where our history has been passed down through song, through storytelling, and through oral means and music and dance rather than in books. So I don't know. I think that's perhaps why I love oral history. I think oral history may be subjective in the telling, but in context and with simple, straightforward analysis, what it gives us is real insights into people's lived realities. Now, for me, it makes history come alive in a way that dry academic text couldn't do.
Yeah.
So when we were writing The Heart of the Race, it was really important to us that our primary audience, you know, when you write a book, quite often you're asked, who do you envisage as your primary audience? Well, clearly our primary audience was black women. Anyone else who read it, great, but it was primarily black women, and it was black women like ourselves, and we wanted them to be able to own their history. We wanted them to recognise their mothers, their grandmothers, their sisters, their aunties, you know. And that's why, incidentally, we use this collective we that people talk about. It enabled us to say, this is what happened to us. Now, in terms of the kick in the belly, I'm really hoping that people will have a similar response. Clearly, it's not contemporary people talking. It's voices coming to us from way back when. And sometimes we're having to filter their voices through the eyes and ears of others. But What I hope people will feel when they read these stories is we know these women. We know these women because we are these women.
I keep saying this, but I really did feel connected to what I was reading, and I think it's because of the way that you do weave in testimonials, and I think this might have been one of the first times that I've actually read from Black women at that time. And I think it's really important that you write in this style. And yeah, you're right. Academic texts about slavery are often very dry, and hard to digest. So through the method of including testimonies from people, or even creatively how you've done through testimonies written by other people that have been about women, I think it's just such an excellent way of bringing the history to life, because often we can end up centering ourselves, well, let's say some academics can end up centering their own self in telling these stories, and then completely omit the voices and the records of people that exist still, that you've been able to find. And I think that relates to one of my big gripes about people that say that, well, we can't decolonize because we can't find it. But clearly it's there. It's just not being looked hard enough for.
It absolutely is there. It absolutely is there. As we've said before, you just have to know where to look. And I know you mentioned, I don't know whether you mentioned in the introduction, I was involved a few years ago in a commission that was set up by the Mayor of London to look at London's heritage institutions and to try to encourage museums and art galleries and other places to just reflect London's diversity in a way that they weren't doing. And you'd be surprised how many archivists and curators we met in the course of this investigation who said, we don't know anything about this history, this is not our specialism. And it used to make me want to tear my hair because, I'm going to be very controversial here. I don't think there's such a thing as Black history. There's just hidden history, and there's loads and loads and loads of hidden histories, gay histories, women's histories, Black histories, disabled histories. There's all kinds of histories that haven't been told and that need to be told. So, when you meet people who say we don't know enough to be able to tell this story, I would question that. I would really question that. I think there's a kind of blindness or colour blindness, I don't know what the word is, some kind of myopia that allows them to just filter the story through their own eyes. And I was reading even this morning in the newspaper something about the text that is given to would-be citizens in the UK and how whitewashed it is. It's not good enough. It's not good enough. There is absolutely no great in Great Britain without the story of slavery, colonialism and imperialism. That is a given. And, when we want to come into more recent history, you're in a situation now, I think Akel said this, and it really resonated with me, where people who fought and gave their lives for Britain in the Second World War have less access to enter this country than the people who we were fighting against. This is ludicrous. We have to revisit our history in a way that tells the uncomfortable truths. And that is going to enrich not only those of us who've been hidden from that story, but also those of us who were perpetrators or agents in that story.
Yeah.
It makes for a more honest self-assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that you also do very well in A Kick in the Belly, is to tell the nuanced stories, the ones that make you feel very uncomfortable, to think, that's really awful that you played this hand in this part of the history. So, for example, there was a part that I'd read of people who had managed to get their freedom or buy their freedom that then involved themselves in the oppression of their own people. And those are obviously very uncomfortable things to read, but these are things that are important to understand if we're going to really understand how complex slavery was. So in describing the multitude of horrors that Black women were subjected to, you do paint a very nuanced picture of the complexities of their lives, so the good and the bad. So whilst also debunking some of our misconceptions, such as how house girls might have had a less difficult time because they were on their backs, or why it's important for us to reckon with the varying survival strategies of these women, especially in the cases where they may have wed or played an active role in slavery, such as buying their freedom. So why is it important for us to reckon with the good, the bad and the ugly with our history?
Because we're complex people, and I think we have a tendency, all of us, have a tendency to want to big up our heroes and sheroes and put them on pedestals and try to assume that somehow they were superior beings. History is made by ordinary people, and that means that history is made by people with contradictions, people with confusion, people who do bad things as well as good things, people who may not be perfect. That's an important lesson, I think, if we're to move on and to build and create new things. Now, I don't know about you, I feel we're living in extraordinary times, not just COVID-19 and all the economic fallout that we're anticipating, but also, Trump's warmongering, the absolute ludicrous situation of a no-deal Brexit. I can go on and on. Now, to me, the knowledge that our foremothers survived a similar Holocaust, that they not only survived it, but they found ways to live through it, to celebrate their lives and to tell the tale, to sing the tale, to dance the tale. That to me is a message of hope, and it's a really sorely needed message right now. We owe it to those women to come through what we're going through with strength and resilience, because they did it so that we could live. We must do it so that our children and our children's children can live. And that's a very, very powerful message. And it's a message that for me only comes through revisiting history and trying to reimagine the absolute horror of a life lived in chains. It's very, very hard for us to imagine that now. But I think it's important for us to imagine it and to reimagine it, because for many women to this day, slavery is very alive and very real. They're still going through it. You've only got to look at the dead bodies at the bottom of the Mediterranean right now, many of which are the bodies of black women, to imagine a similar story of people who were taken across the Atlantic as part of the triangular trade. It's very real. It was then, but it's also now. So I guess I'm sort of, it's a rambling way of saying that, all of these things are relevant to us today, and that's why this history is so important.
Wow. It is really amazing to listen to you reflect on this and to speak on this. I think when we contextualise where we're at now, and to quote you, in these extraordinary times, we should always remember the people that have come before us and whose shoulders we are now standing on, because our struggles now are, I'm trying to think of a good way to put it, our struggles now compared to the struggles that our ancestors faced are a lot less severe, of course, physically to our bodies, but mentally we're still we're still living through the legacies of slavery and colonialism. But if it wasn't for what our ancestors had gone through and what they had fought for, we wouldn't be where we are now.
Yeah, and I think it's important to define those of us who live in the West and who have relatively comfortable lifestyles, we have food in our bellies, our kids go to school, we are relatively free from disease and pestilence. It's very easy for us to become complacent. But if we think about the places, the countries that we come from, and the people who constitute our relatives and our nearest and dearest in terms of that migratory journey, many of them are still living that horror. They're still living lives where they're deprived of food and deprived of the basic necessities of life, food, clothing and shelter. So I think it's important for us when we re-envisage slavery and we reimagine the lives of those women, that we also connect it to the here and now, and we try to make that link, because one of the fears I had about The Kick in the Belly, apart from the fact that it is at times a hard read, I hope it's also a read that will empower and make people smile and make people feel proud of their ancestors.
I did have moments where I was like, yes.
I hope that also is one of the side effects. But when we revisit that story, you know, my fear was that people would think, oh, you know, all that horror and nothing could be done about it, and what can we do about it now? The truth is that we still have an anti-slavery struggle on our hands, you know, and whether we call it slavery or whether we call it economic migration or whether we call it, you know, farming or whatever stories they call it, sex trafficking, there are all kinds of aspects of the story that's told in The Kick in the Belly that are very much alive and kicking today. And that applies to the arms trade. You know, they sold us guns and gin then. What are they selling us now? Guns and gin. You know, it hasn't changed a lot. And the same people who sold their brothers and sisters down the river are still doing it today in some African countries. So we don't need to be complacent. We need to be looking at that history in terms of its relevance to us now, what we can do about it now, and how we can ensure that it isn't reproduced in the future.
So there is a common misconception, or rather a justification of slavery, that puts the blame onto the enslaved for not fighting hard enough for their freedom. Usually people will say, well, there were so many more slaves than planters or colonialists, why couldn't they just fight back? And that's often used as to put the blame on the victims of the slave trade. So one thing that is abundantly clear throughout A Kick in the Belly is the resourcefulness, the strategic prowess and the unrelenting dedication to freedom that Black women led in revolting. So even in smaller acts of resistance, and those were the yes moments, I found one quite funny about how a slave that was that worked in the house, how she would only open the windows on the left-hand side of the house or then on the right-hand side and keep switching it up. Just small acts of resistance. And there was obviously some much bigger stories as well, which I won't go into here because I want people to read the book. But, sorry?
No, great, good. No, don't tell the whole story yet.
No. It's so tempting to discuss this with you because there was proper good moments where I was like, yeah. But, you know, hopefully people will read the book and they'll get their moments as well because it's not all doom and gloom. And it's important for us to understand that as well and to read that. But if you're okay with telling us it without revealing too much of the book, are you able to tell us a bit about the story of the women Maroons in Jamaica?
Well, yes, you know, there were Maroons all, right across the Americas. It wasn't just Jamaica. You had them in Brazil, you had them in Florida, you had them in Curacao. There were Maroon communities just about everywhere. You had enslaved people and people with the capacity to run away. And quite often those communities were formed by people who were first generation enslaved. In other words, they had experienced the Middle Passage. They'd come from Africa. They had a memory of what they'd come from. And in fact, if you look at the history of Jamaica, the British couldn't have taken Jamaica from the Spanish if it hadn't been for the assistance of Maroon communities who had their fill of the Spanish and thought the British might be slightly better colonisers. But yes, they found those established runaway communities way back in the 16th, 15th, 17th century, 1655s. And because those stories were told through the lens of contemporary colonisers, predominantly white males, what you have is an insinuation or an assumption that the status of those women was subjugated, that they were forcibly kidnapped, that they didn't want to be part of those communities, they were given little choice. Now, if you know the story of Nanny of the Maroons, which I won't go into in detail, what you see is that women in Maroon communities often played a vital role, a central role, and not only were they central to the survival of those communities, they were actually revered and respected. Now, just a little bit about Nanny, because it's important to put her in context. She not only had a fancy name like her brothers, Kodjo and Kwame, I think it was, or Kweku. She also played what anybody from an African background like myself would recognise as a traditional warrior priestess role. shanty warrior priestess who used to rally the troops and encourage them to fight with fearless resistance. A lot of the cultural practices and the language used by those communities can be traced directly back to those African countries that they had hailed from. One of my favourite quotes in A Kick in the Belly is from a contemporary descendant who talks about the way children in communities of Maroons today are taught to respect their elders and to eschew criminal acts. And it resonates directly with some of the tales that you had recorded by the earliest Europeans who went to African countries, who found similar situations, communities where people were respected. Now, I'm not trying to create a rosy picture. Yes, we had slavery in Africa before Europeans arrived, and we had other practices that would make us now shudder with horror. But every act and every action and every history has to be placed in its own time, in its own context. And I think it's important to hear those stories, particularly the story of the Maroons, because it gives us a really tantalising hint of how Africa might have looked if we hadn't had to deal with European involvement and interference.
Yeah, I found that part really interesting, and it's nice to have an avenue through which to imagine what it could have looked like had it not been for European involvement, as you say. But yeah, I'm really excited for people to read the book, because it really does, there are happy and sad moments to it, and to keep going on about how nuanced it truly is, and I'm sure that there's going to be moments where people are shedding tears, but also moments where they're like, yes, go on, and I definitely had them moments.
Good, thank you.
So we're now rounding up to the final question. Thank you so much for taking the time and explaining all of this to us and to discussing your book with us. So looking at the legacy and the impact of your work, which has given a voice to Black women for decades, including the heart of the race, what impact do you hope your body of work will have on the generations both presently and in the future?
Okay, I'm going to answer that question in two parts, because a lot of the work that I've done has been around education and around decolonising the curriculum. And I think in terms of that body of work, books like Blood, Sweat and Tears and Racetracks and Toolkit for Tackling Racism and Trial and Error, all those things that people would probably only know if they're involved in education. What I hope is that they offer teachers and educators a really pragmatic, down-to-earth approach to the complex challenges of tackling racism both in schools and in colleges and wider society. That has certainly been the focus of my work, and within that, a real endeavour to try to show that when we decolonise the curriculum, we are not just talking about history, we're talking about every single area of the curriculum. You can do it in maths, you can do it in science, you can do it in drama, you can do it in all kinds of ways. And that invisibility, that failure to acknowledge our achievement and our involvement and our input is my definition of what decolonising the curriculum actually involves. I'll just say a bit more about this, because I was talking to Suzanne about it just recently, Suzanne Scafe being one of the other authors of The Heart of the Race. And what we were lamenting was the fact that so much good work was done in the 70s and 80s by teachers, by educators, organisations like ILEA, the Inner London Education Authority, in the days when they had an input into what was taught in schools. And yet you get the feeling in the context of Black Lives Matters that a lot of people are trying to reinvent the wheel. They're coming to this as if no work has been done before. I think that's really unfortunate. I think it's important to build on the shoulders of previous generations, to recognise the work that was done, and, you know, to make sure that that work isn't ignored or overlooked. And I'm not just talking about my own work. You know, there were armies of people who engaged with these questions, who thought about inventive, innovative, creative, entertaining ways to get kids engaged in the classroom and to get learners to recognise that the curriculum should not be Eurocentric. So that's that body of work. I really hope, even though a lot of it is out of print and people are asking me to put it online, I will get round to it eventually. That body of work hopefully will continue to have that impact. And in terms of the heart of the race and the kick in the belly, which I suppose is the sort of Black feminist canon, I really hope that these two books will place Black women centre stage where they belong. Not just socially, but also historically. I certainly hope that those books will inspire women everywhere, not just Black women, particularly Black women, but not just Black women, and inspire them to recognise their own power, their own resilience and their own agency, their own beauty, their own spirit. All of those things, I hope, come through those books in a powerful and very immediate way. I really hope that my work will add nuance and insight and thereby help to create a better mutual understanding, not just for our own people, but for people everywhere. Because, as I've said before, slavery hasn't gone away, racism hasn't gone away, the far right seems to be on the ascendancy, and it's really, really important that those who are genuinely committed to a world in which our children grow up free of these isms and schisms and these ridiculous divisions that we create to divide ourselves, that we build on a history that is informed, which is enlightened, and which is empowering. And if nothing else, I hope that those two books can be described in all those ways.
Thank you so much, and that's a really good note to leave this on. I think academics, ordinary people, historians, anyone at all can learn a lot from you and a lot from your work and your words. And hopefully through listening to this as well, because I feel like I'm going to walk away from this having learned a lot from you, and I genuinely mean that. So thank you so much, Stella.
Well, thank you, Sophia. It was a pleasure talking to you.